Hello, everyone. Today, I'm super excited to talk about something that I feel very passionate about, which is this vision of getting security out of this CNAPP hole that it's been in. I feel like our industry has just been stuck dead around this endless category of uh, just literally like data center security, just everything you could possibly need to secure the cloud, and just this giant list of features that no one can really do well, that no one really wants. And so I am here to both argue that CNAPP is bad and to argue for what should come in its place. And so first, just about me, I'm James. I've been a security engineer for about 10 years at different size organizations, from startups to small enterprise to uh, FedRAMP, and part of people doing startups, just really all over the place, and gotten a diverse amount of experience. But most of that time has been in cloud native architectures. And so that's most of my background. And as part of that, I just slowly was posting on LinkedIn about my opinions about different tools as I was testing them, my experiences with them, and really just information that's hard to get out there. Because if you look at a spreadsheet of CNAPP vendors, they will all look incredibly similar. Because if, for example, you can show one API, then suddenly you can call yourself an API security company. And so really the goal of Latio is to help engineers specifically find tools that meet the requirements that they're trying to build. And so with that, I'm going to take my philosophy background and I put this out as an actual argument for, let's start at the conclusion, which is point 4. CNAPP should be an organization's lowest priority security tool. And that's really the argument I want to make, is not that CNAPP is totally useless by itself, but that instead of prioritizing it first, it should actually be the last thing that we prioritize. And that's the heart of the argument. And the reason for that is, first, that CNAPP was created to increase revenue for large companies and not to solve actual problems. Second, that there are too many different end users in CNAPP to make it a usable experience for any of them. And finally, that CNAPPs are the worst at protecting the infrastructure that's the most important. And so let's start with that first argument, that CNAPP was created for revenue first. And to me, especially because I was in the early days of cloud security looking at different tools in this space, I really strongly experienced how this idea of CNAPP emerged from pretty distinct technologies. And those were CSPM and then what came to be known as CWPP. But for a long time, there wasn't even really a name for it, because this was just the idea of doing some kind of runtime protection of cloud workloads. And it really got egregious when many companies wanted to start saying they did this CWPP part. And really all they meant was even vulnerability scanning was enough to count as workload protection. And in these early days, Kubernetes security specifically was in such a new place. I remember just constant debates about if any runtime security was even necessary for Kubernetes. People still will feel like there's this like perfect vision you can have of a Kubernetes cluster where everything is perfectly scanned and vetted ahead of time, deployed into production, and it's not vulnerable. It's perfectly protected. And over time, anyone who was in the weeds on those technologies knew that that just wasn't really the case. More, you were protected by people not understanding how they worked. I remember actually doing a fun little internal pen test for one of our Kubernetes applications when I had just started somewhere. And I started running kube control commands to test for command injection. And all of a sudden, the development team was like, whoa, 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 stop doing that. Don't do that. Don't do that. Because again, it really got by on the fact that a lot of people just didn't know how Kubernetes worked. And so that CWPP piece over time got sort of de-emphasized in favor of this CSPM piece. And I have some examples here of how people started, just to draw some comparisons between companies that have been both combative and then have had partnerships and are competitors but are friends. And the clearest case to me is Twistlock and Redlock, which was the first acquisition that happened within CNAPP. And that was Palo Alto creating Prisma Cloud out of basically wrapping duct tape around both of those products and then saying, now we have invented CNAPP. And that combination really set the stage for what other vendors would have to do, because Sysdig and Aqua specifically were already pretty well established as early container security players, both on the vulnerability scanning side, more on Aqua for like Kubebench and some of the early like Trivy container scanning, and then Sysdig with Falco on the runtime container side. And both of these technologies were well established, but Paolo was the one who came along and like put it together with a CSPM and called it a new platform. Similarly, early days of Lacework were primarily around looking for anomalies within AWS cloud logs. And then they expanded into the workload space and expanded in their detection logic. But again, everyone sort of started out as either focused on the workloads or focused on the cloud. And that's really why I just chose people here. Like Wiz and Sentinel One had a very early partnership. Aqua and Orca recently created a partnership because these tools are, while they're all CNAPPs and they all check all of the boxes for the Gartner spreadsheet that has, exactly what boxes you're supposed to check. In reality, practitioners know that these tools are pretty different. And what I'll argue later is that the end users of them are different. But for now, let's stay focused on just how these early practitioners, these early vendors, were very focused on either the cloud layer of the application or on the workload layer. And really, Prisma Cloud was the one that put together those things, and results weren't correlated between the platforms. It really just became, I remember the first time I saw micro segmentation was a feature of Prisma Cloud because it was something Twistlock could do. But it wasn't clear yet how that would fit into the CNAPP platform idea. And so you just have all these like loose features of what could we do with an agent? What can we do with containers? What can we do with cloud logs? And people just stretching the definition of what they can accomplish because they have access to the data. And I think the thing over time that really proves that the CNAPP vision is not what people actually find valuable within cloud security is that the most popular CNAPP, which is Wiz, is the one that has the least features. If I were to create a feature spreadsheet list, um, especially over time, right? Like Wiz code is one of the latest entries into a space that most of the other providers have already had SCA, SAST offerings with or different code offerings in general. And same with their agent. They were one of the later entries to have an agent to do runtime defense. But that really didn't stop the gain because the purpose of CNAPP was never really to have all of these disjointed features. I think the heart of it was just giving teams visibility into the cloud. I think most practitioners had an experience that was very similar to my own early on doing cloud security, where I basically got handed, hey, the devs have run amok with the CTO's credit card. We don't know what they've been building. They're launching something soon, and we need you to go in and figure out what's happened. And really, to that person who was in my shoes, who maybe had very little understanding of DevOps, of containerization, of application security, maybe they came from a traditional Windows background primarily, or even medium Linux experience, like you're asking a lot for that person to suddenly go and give developers guidance on these emerging technologies around containerization, EC2 instances like S3 buckets, how applications would change their architecture. And really, CNAPPs were about giving that person both comfort and visibility into something they didn't understand. And to me, that's the heart of what CNAPP was really the reason it had such a quick rise compared to other tools is because it was solving a real problem. It was just never this vision of like runtime protection to code scanning to cloud visibility. The problem was really just around that cloud visibility slice. And I think that continues to be the most important part of it. And the other piece I'll say is that there's a reason firewall vendors continue to get into this space. And it's because within cloud native architectures, firewalls are just not as common as they were. And so I do think a large part of this CNAPP play is just simply around consolidating and platformatization in the face of decreasing firewall spend over time with cloud architectures. And so both of those things combined, I think, create this reality of a giant mess of a tool that simultaneously drives the entire industry, and yet nobody really wants, and that people are just practitioners largely are unhappy with the tools they have, and yet these tools also command most of the budget, more because of market realities than anything about the product itself. And so all that to say that I stand by CNAPP being created for revenue first. But now let's talk about a little bit of more the persona problem that I think lies at the heart of CNAPP. And actually, before I do that, I'll go ahead and answer this question here, and I can put it up on the screen. For the biggest gaps with CNAPPs when it comes to Kubernetes security, this is definitely a piece that has been the biggest struggle for me as someone who loves Kubernetes security. And it goes back to this idea of it depends on the CNAPP. So Sysdig has led the charge on runtime Kubernetes security for a long time. But especially on the agentless side, the longer a company was agentless, the harder time they've had coming up to par with Kubernetes security. And one part of that struggle is the biggest consistent gap I see is the quality of the container detections. Normally, when I do container detections amongst either CNAPPs or legacy EDR players, I literally cannot get them to trigger an alert, and I think they're broken. And I have to like work with the product team to try to figure out like, did I deploy this thing correctly? Is something wrong? And then sure enough, it ends up being, oh well, we actually have this custom query that can sort of put together what you've done. And it's because these tools were architected not from the ground up for Kubernetes, and so the detection qualities are just laughably bad. And that's something I actually think Twistlock is pretty good at, just as an example, because it was actually founded around that. And so even Prisma's offering in this area is actually like decent because they've continued to build on that foundation of actually being made for Kubernetes. And to me, that's the distinction. You can put vendors in a bucket where they either started with Kubernetes and they're pretty good at it. But we'll discuss here on the next slide why I think even those vendors have fallen behind. But then the other bucket of CNAPP vendors are those who didn't start in Kubernetes and have sort of been playing catch up, but they're at the advantage of that's where what the market has wanted. So let me hop into CNAPP being made for everyone and therefore no one, and getting at these three distinct personas that I think exist really heavily within a CNAPP. And this is the heart of why I have yet to see a CNAPP fully satisfy the use cases of all three of these people in the same platform. And I think if you separate it this way, it helps make sense of why some CNAPPs took off while others lagged behind, because the majority of the security industry comes from like a Windows sysadmin background, and they are familiar with SIMs like maybe Splunk or QRadar or older ones, and they're familiar with EDRs like CrowdStrike and SentinelOne, primarily around protecting both Windows endpoints in an enterprise and server infrastructure somewhere. And then more recently, like Linux starts to become a part of that picture as the expansion into the cloud. And so the primary goal of what most security people wanted was a way to do this vulnerability scanning and get visibility and protection into these types of static assets into the cloud. And I think that's why CSPM really took off as that first piece. While it was more like the DevOps persona that wasn't emerging, I still kind of think DevOps is just sysadmin people who bothered to learn Kubernetes and code pipelines and this type of stuff. But it was really that smaller set of the market that was interested in these Kubernetes security platforms and the runtime defense and the stuff that was emerging with Falco and what you could do with it. But really, those companies had to then pivot back to try to satisfy what most of the market wanted, right? Like a lot of these vendors, I remember sort of slowly deciding to release their own CSPM functionality because as much as they loved the runtime protection that they were providing, as much as they knew that it provided real security value, every single call they were on was just, do you have agentless scanning? How do we do the agentless scanning capabilities for static assets became the defining feature of those platforms. And now as CNAPP continues to expand, I think it just continues to run into more issues where it tries to satisfy these ASPM feature sets like SCA, SAS, these code to cloud pictures, where really an IAC and container scanning are a part of that normally as well. And that's why, honestly, most CNAPPs, not all of them, again, some of them started more containerization, but most are also not very good or useful at the container scanning or IAC scanning part. They have all these caveats. There's all sorts of missing information. Whether it's something as simple as the Docker layers, so you can actually patch things, or like nonsensical patch guidance. Like really, the more that these CNAPPs try to expand into the code, they're really building for another persona that's not used to using this product. And just an example of that is I always sort of joke about I can't see a developer being happy installing like a Palo Alto or Fortinet VS Code extension, right? Like it's just not the kind of company tooling that people associate with those providers, because it's honestly never been like a developer centric platform. And so really that's how I view this developer split, is really ASPM around the code features, CSPM as really being what CNAPP is, and all this other stuff has sort of gotten like piled into it because of all the money that's in creating these big platforms that make nobody happy. And then the other side that's been underserved for the longest time, and this gets at the question you asked, Ophelia, was around the security operations side. And I remember trying to operationalize CWPP and continue, like even recently, trying to operationalize it. Like it is really hard because you're trying to get value out of a tool that really does not give you much context into what happened. Where typically all you're given in the early days, it was like this host triggered an alert, which was laughably bad. But now usually it's at least saying like this pod, like a potentially malicious process started in this pod at this time. And if you're a security analyst and you get that alert, I don't know what you're supposed to do with it because that pod's probably not even there anymore. And so, what are you supposed to investigate? Was it malicious behavior or not? It never really fully delivered on this idea of helping security teams understand what actually happened during an incident. And that gap and stagnation around that, because you had vendors start to really build out that story, but they all had to run to chase this CNAPP budget and satisfy like systems engineers. And the SOC is the one who suffered for it because all of a sudden they're dealing mostly with like cloud misconfigurations and less with actual runtime detection alerts where they can actually do something about it. So I think those are the problems that underlie most of CNAPP is people miss the fact that it's really trying to satisfy all three of these people in the same place. And that's where I still don't know in the long run if that's possible. I think some people are closer than others to trying to do it. But I still think it's a fundamental challenge to the idea of a CNAPP platform. And so finally, I think CNAPP, because of that persona chasing that happened, had to deprioritize the most important infrastructure. And this is where I'll get to the argument of how we should switch our priorities around and how we evaluate them. And it's essentially this, that CNAPPs excel at protecting the infrastructure that needs it the least. And so uh, because CNAPPs evolved around this idea of agentless vulnerability scanning, really it got good at dissecting file paths and vulnerabilities on Windows and Linux assets. And typically applications, most organizations have moved their applications to Kubernetes. And I talk to people all the time who are either unaware of that or continue to try to deny it or try to think they don't need to pay attention to Kubernetes or to containerization in general. But just the latest CNCF report, you can go and look at it, has all of the details on Linux adoption, on Kubernetes adoption, and it continues to just grow and grow as the way that organizations are hosting their applications. There is an asterisk here that I don't think it's at the expense of Kubernetes, but it's just continuing this containerized architecture and microservice architecture where you're adding more and more into serverless functions, you're adding more and more into ECS and other equivalent services for just elastic container hosting. Like these ephemeral containerized architectures are the standard for the cloud. I don't think they're becoming the standard, like they just are the standard. And so in my mind, if you're not building your entire cloud security program around this architecture first, then you're really not prioritizing the data to the business that matters the most. Right? You might have Windows servers out somewhere, you might have Linux servers doing small functions, but when people think about what's the vulnerable infrastructure in my cloud, it is the application that's hosting all of my user data that's highly permissioned to all these other cloud assets. And to me, that should be the starting point, the application in the cloud, rather than this thing that we leave until the end, where we view it as like this advanced security uh, continuation. And so it's not just Kubernetes. We also see nerd stuff like gRPC gaining a foothold. GraphQL adoption continues to be debated, but it's just an example of this technology is emerging so quickly that really it can be tempting, I think, to try to ignore it or try to overly simplify it. But to me, this is where we should spend most of our time. And we can see that Sysdig and Aqua were the most meaningful security companies early on because this is exactly what they prioritized. But the market reality forced them to build more and more agentless scanning, more and more server scanning. And in my mind, that's why the CNAPP market is at where it's at, where we just have these confusing collections of features that are really leaving the actual security of an organization underserved. And so it's not saying that CNAPP's unimportant. It's just saying that it's least important. And so let me show what I think is the alternative. And it's more about how we prioritize these things and less about abandoning any of them wholeheartedly. Um, I'll talk about some cost saving stuff that I think can exist as a result of this transition. But the intuitive prioritization for security teams, I mean, I just talk about this because it is exactly the trend that I myself fall into, and that I continue to, when I talk to organizations, this is the way that they continue to approach. I don't think I can single handedly fix this problem, but I am trying to suggest that cloud native organizations, especially, can really flip the way that they're prioritizing the importance of these things. And so typically a security team wants to just start getting visibility around the cloud, and they don't even know what's there. They don't have the skill sets necessarily to have development experience, to have Kubernetes experience, to understand like what containerization really means. And so they initially go looking for this kind of lightweight visibility. And unfortunately, when you start down that trend, you're either going to end up with an existing on-prem solution, and this is like the worst case scenario. If you're in this situation, I'm sorry, where you're using like some legacy tool, and I won't name names to try to be nice to people, but and you buy their acqui-hired CNAPP tool, and then you very quickly just get buried in thousands of alerts. Uh, and you're essentially trying to learn cloud infrastructure through the alerts of your CSPM tool. Um, and over time, people just get stuck here, where you wonder if this is why this issue is so important to me, is because you can feel so stuck when you're just looking at 10,000 alerts and wondering like, am I doing something wrong? And like I remember trying to hunt down talks from Netflix and Meta and all these, like, what are they doing? And the shift left ideology, to try to figure out like, what am I not getting? Why are there so many alerts here and I can't seemingly fix any of them? And it seems to be every time I bring up to a developer any single one of these alerts, it's a conflict, right? Like if you have some EBS volume that's unencrypted, and then you've got to figure out, oh, well, that's unencrypted because it's actually an underlying node and it's not hosting sensitive data and it's a separate VPC, and we can't fix it unless we clone the drives over. We'd have to recreate the cluster, but we can't. Like every single one of these 10,000 alerts creates like a quarter or 2 quarters worth of work and requires all of this digging. And so I think that's the fundamental reason I don't want to prioritize this, is because you're getting essentially a giant backlog of work that you can't even do yourself. And you're just creating a giant unprioritized, or even, the prioritization thing. I'm sure they'll all say that they have the best prioritization engine in the world, but you're creating things that have dubious outcomes that you can't even do anything about yourself. And so instead, this is why I flip it to, if you invest in the runtime solution, it can be really intimidating for people if to start there, because step one is usually deploying an agent to your cluster, and people get very nervous about that. But the reality of the situation, first of all, is that modern agents using eBPF are much safer to deploy in general. But then the additional piece is that like that is a excellent learning experience that builds the foundation for building a cloud security program. Like if you don't have the ability to have a conversation with the team that owns your Kubernetes infrastructure, to get Helm set up, to get kube control set up, to get some of these basic things set up so that you can understand conceptually what's happening, there's no point in the infrastructure scanning, is what I'm trying to say. That because the majority of your cloud infrastructure is this runtime application hosting stuff, you should start by tackling that problem and understanding what's there, instead of starting to try to like work your way around it and sort of circle into it endlessly. But instead, if you start there and just get that deployed, you'll actually have contextual alerts, and not just the contextual alerts, you'll also actually be able to block and prevent attacks that happen. You'll be able to see someone's trying to exploit my resource on my application, and I can actually kill a container, I can kill a process, I can actually take an action without bugging other teams, without trying to just create endless tickets that don't go anywhere. And so I think the value, even though it's more intimidating to do this runtime solution, which I call CADR because I see this convergence over time of this emerging ADR field with this emerging cloud detection response, but also CWPP, like all of these things are coming together into a single agent. So when I say CADR, I just mean whichever agent-based thing you choose to use for runtime protection, like that should be the beginning of your cloud security program, because you'll actually get immediate value while then you can go fix the 2,000 line backlog. But the way that security programs get stuck is they view these other things as subsequent to that giant 10,000, 100,000 item backlog, where they go, once we get our cloud posture in order, then we can think about code scanning, then we can think about runtime protection. But the reality should be flipped. It's just once you do the runtime protection, then you can worry about fixing this giant backlog of work that you've created. And that goes into, I know I'm low on time, but it's also why I go into the ASPM as second priority instead of, it's just a different perspective where even though you don't have the infra scanning, the way you're actually going to fix all of that infrastructure scanning is usually as infrastructure as code. Whether that's Helm charts, whether it's Terraform, whether it's OpenTofu, whether it's CloudFormation, whatever. Most organizations are managing their application at least, not by like SSHing into pods and deploying or some random way, but either through some kind of combination of GitOps or IAC. And the way you're going to fix those unencrypted S3 buckets that get detected is at the code level. And most CNAPPs are really immature at creating that code to cloud picture. And so that's why really when I say a future of security free from CNAPP, I mean, let's separate these things into 3 distinct categories. Let's start with the runtime protection, and then let's invest in the code protection. And then we treat the infrastructure scanning as an afterthought. And I think if you do this, you can also unlock a lot of cost savings because these CNAPP tools all are insanely expensive. But the CADR is an emerging market that is all over the place in terms of how expensive or not it is. ASPM is the same way. But if you treat your CSPM, there's a lot of great like open source tools. You're treating it more as an asset inventory with visibility. And there's a lot of players around there where instead of trying to base your whole security program more and more on a single tool that continues to get you more and more vendor locked in, and so they can continue to raise prices up, you can save money by separating these functions out a little bit. And this is the tug and pull between platformization and point solutions that I won't get fully into today. But high level, I'm not saying go full point solution. I'm not saying like, hey, you need 15 different code scanners, 15 different CSPMs, whatever. But I think that this broader consolidating platforms around end users where CADR is built for your security operations team, ASPM is built for your developers, and CSPM is built for your systems team. I think that makes a lot more sense than trying to force all of this stuff into the single place. So with that, I will pause for any questions. I see Kyle put a long one. So I'll read that real quick, but I only have a couple minutes. So high level, thank you for coming. Hope it's all helpful. Yes, let me read this real quick. If I try to put it on screen, I don't know what'll happen. Yeah, it's long. Yeah, I think it comes down essentially to this. The source of this runtime stuff is the code, which is why I view a lot of things through this lens of the early Snyk Sysdig partnership, where the idea with Snyk is looking at all your code stuff and Sysdig is doing your runtime protection, and the runtime protection feeds into the code analysis for developers and prioritization. That continues to be the way I think that, especially for cloud native architectures, just makes way more sense than CNAPP. Well, let me go to the Q&A tab. Sweet. Thank you guys for joining me. Pending anything else, I'll go ahead and put it on the slide for the next talk, and I will hop on out. Oh, hold on. I got another question. To answer that question, I view that perimeter attack path stuff as just a feature of CSPM, because most CSPMs have it at this point. And the difference between those tools is the depth in which they provide it. So something like Upwind is much more Kubernetes centric and will build an attack path that's much more localized to a cluster, whereas Wiz will take more of like a load balancer in approach. And so really, that's why I just view that perimeter stuff as helping prioritize and as part of the overall package. And I will cede now. I saw Meet just pop into the backstage, so.
All righty, James. That Presentation rocked me to my core. I appreciate you. Thank you so much. And thank you everyone for joining us. Follow please in the chat. You'll see James' LinkedIn. Please, he drops nothing but amazing material. Check him out.